Looking at Jaws, you can see that an action started it off, the shark attack. And an action, the shooting of the gun to blow up the shark, was what required at the end to arrive at closure. That's an action story in action. Now, in that story, although actions are taken, how much of the story is about trying to decide what to do about the shark, whether they should hire somebody or not, whether they should go out on the boat or not. There's a lot of time spent on deliberation for a story which is driven by action, and even though we think of it as an action picture because the moments of action are so powerfully told in the storytelling, in fact, there may even be more time spent in deliberation in Jaws than there is in action. But it's an action story because action kicked it off and action closed it off at the end. That's why it felt complete. Now, as a side note, last week we talked about the main character resolve of change or steadfast. Would you say that Chief Brody changes, or does he remain steadfast? Is his character the same at the end, or is it different? Well, if you look at the next scene that actually occurs, we don't have a clip of it here, but you'll see that after all the smoke clears, he's paddling along with Hooper, the Richard Dreyfuss character, and he says, "You know, I used to be afraid of the water." And the response is, "I can't imagine why." You see, he's lost his fear of the water. He's changed. He's not the same as he was. At the beginning, "We know about you, Chief. You won't even get your feet wet," you know. And now he's paddling along quite merrily in the water after having faced the danger. Now here's a real key. That if he had been unable to overcome that fear before he pulled the trigger, he could not have pulled the trigger because he'd be sitting there cowering in the ship or hanging onto the mast as it was sinking, and he'd be unable to move into action. He must have changed. But when did it happen? We didn't really see it happen. In fact, we're not even really notified about it until after the climax. So how can that be, that a character changes after the fact? No, he had to have changed beforehand, or he would have been cowering and unable to take the action. So how did this work? Well, there's two types of change that we talked about as primary ways in which the character may change. They may consciously change, or they may be changed. One is active and one is passive. That has nothing to do with whether it's an action story or a decision story. It just has to do with whether the character consciously makes a decision to change or is simply changed by the experience. In this case, he's changed by the experience. He may not even see himself as much of a different person. In some stories, the character may not even realize at all that they have changed in any way. And yet we, the audience, need to know to tell whether they were a character who has become someone new or is stuck with their old way of doing things, and whether the author is telling us, therefore, that it's better to stick with the way you're doing things in this particular problem, or better to adopt a new way of doing things when faced with this kind of problem. So in this case, it's not a leap of faith story where he has to make some big decision and then make this leap. It's a story that's called a non-leap of faith story, the converse story, in which he changes, is then able to take the action, but doesn't even realize it until after the fact, may not realize it at all until we realize it. But we need to be told as an audience. As far as action and decision goes, Jaws, though, is a perfect example. Shark attack at the beginning, blow up the shark at the end. Action, bookended by action.